Hello there, people of the internet. Today I'm going to be answering a completely hypothetical question, and it's going to be based more around the idea of a reality that is different than the one that we actually exist in. What if the United States military ended up adopting the Ruger Mini 14 over the AR-15 like they did? Now, I feel like before we go ahead and start really digging into this question, we should go ahead and start looking at where we should go into some of the histories of the different military small arms that we have here in the United States. So we're going to go ahead and start off with this. This is where the legacy of this rifle design really began, and this right here is what made this particular rifle design so mainstream here in the United States. This is the M1 rifle designed by Garand. A lot of people, the military designation for pronouncing this thing is the Garand, but a lot of people get on to me because I'm mispronouncing it because the guy's name was Garand. Both ways of pronouncing it are correct for this, but just to avoid making people irritable, I'm going to go ahead and just call this the M1 rifle, assuming that I don't slip up on that because I've done that before. But the M1 rifle right here, revolutionary for its time. It is the year 1930. War has just taken over Europe, and war will soon again take over Europe. The United States is looking to replace its bolt-action rifles, the 1917, 1903, 1906 rifles that it has in inventory, with self-loading rifles. And this design right here is what they decided to go ahead and go with. Originally, this rifle was going to be chambered in a 270 cartridge, 270 caliber cartridge. It was going to hold 10 rounds of ammunition, but the United States had some ridiculous amount of 30-06 ammo on standby, like, oh, I don't know, 6 billion rounds of ammunition, if memory serves me correctly. Don't quote me on that amount, but I'm fairly certain it was somewhere close to that. They had a lot of ammunition. A lot of 30-06 ammunition available. So they figured that they would go ahead and chamber these new rifles in 30-06. So that is why it has the 8-round capacity. Originally it was made to have 10 for the original design. But going from a 5-round bolt-action rifle to an 8-round semi-automatic self-loading rifle was a tremendous step up. Now, these do not feed from any sort of internal magazine, well, to an extent. They have to have a separate clip system. Is an in-block clip system that is used to feed these rifles. The clip itself has the feed lips, and you cannot feed these rifles short of single loading it without that clip. So that is definitely one of the major downsides of this system. So we'll get into how they went ahead and remediated that. But the 30-06 M1 Garand or M1 rifle is very much, thank you Kevin. Kevin is active now. But it's very much one of the more iconic rifles here in the United States for very good reason. It served our military for an incredibly long time. Basically, all the way up, it even saw, well, all the way up to Vietnam, seeing limited use in Vietnam. I imagine, love bugs, I imagine it even saw use after Vietnam by particular forces that wanted to keep and continue to use the M1 rifle. Now, of course, the technology behind this thing is very limited. And I'm about to run some rounds, and a lot of people who say the M1 Garand is just as good as everything else out on the market are gonna cringe and say that I shouldn't do this with this rifle. Let's go ahead and run a couple of rounds down range. Oh boy. The astute among you will have noticed that I just ran some steel case ammunition through this rifle. That is part of an experiment that I'm running. But that is one of the downsides of this rifle. A lot of people say that you should absolutely not run steel case ammunition through this rifle. That being said, I've ran, oh, I don't know, just shy of like 800 rounds of steel case 30-06 through this rifle, and I'm still yet to see any significant wear on the extractor or on the feed ramps of this thing. And with the updated gas system that I have in this thing, the operating rod is having no issues either. But without up-to-date equipment and whatnot and paying attention to these rifles, running high pressure modern 30-06 is definitely not something that you want to do with this thing. The gas system is definitely one of the shortcomings of this rifle, and the feeding system is also one of the shortcomings of this rifle. Having to feed from some sort of in-block clip, which I apparently tossed over there, is definitely more counterproductive than it is helpful, because if you have some sort of ammunition, some level of ammunition that is not the exact amount that you need for your clip. You can load those into these rifles. As you just saw, I only fired 2 rounds because they're designed to hold 8. They're definitely way more difficult to load, partial load in these rifles. And if you're wanting to top it off, that's a very difficult process in itself. The feed system is just not ideal for these rifles. Whenever you have properly loaded ammo and properly loaded clips, these can be loaded pretty damn fast, but that's not always what happens in the situations that people are in. Now, after World War II, self-loading rifles were definitely becoming the wave of the future, and the United States wanted to have a self-loading rifle that could do the jobs of all of the other rifles, replace the submachine guns and the light machine guns and the rifles and the absolutely everything. And they wanted one that had a better feeding system in it. They took a note from the BAR that they were using, and they actually adopted essentially the M1 system with a better gas system, and it took external box magazines as opposed to having to load a clip inside of your rifle. This rifle would become known as the M14, chambered in the brand new 7.62 NATO cartridge. It was basically very similar to the Garand, like I said, just with a slightly different gas system and a box magazine sticking out of the bottom of the rifle. But the general aesthetics and operating mechanisms of the rifle were basically the same, so troops could pretty much be very capable of identifying the fundamental mechanics of the system that they were running, even with the new rifle, because they would have been used to using these old rifles. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the history of the M14. It was a full auto that they deemed to be not all that great. So they converted it to being basically just semi-auto. Didn't really serve them all that well, not nearly as well as they were thinking. And it was the lack of servitude for that M14 rifle that made them inevitably jump over to the AR-15. Armalite at the time was offering the AR-10, which was the same platform as the AR-15 for the most part. I'm not going to go into, the mechanics behind the AR-10, but the same relative platform as the AR-15, chambered in the same 7.62 NATO cartridge that the M14 was chambered in. The United States went ahead and they kept their M14 because it had the same basic fundamental mechanics as their old M1 rifles. And they chose to keep that as opposed to getting themselves the AR-10. However, it became very clear that an intermediate caliber cartridge was something that they were wanting to go to. They tried doing that with the adoption of the 7.62 NATO round, but it was just too dang powerful. And the poor use of it in Vietnam was one of the main reasons why they adopted an intermediate caliber cartridge. I'm sure if Vietnam never happened, then the AR-15 probably would not have been adopted by United States forces. And the adoption of the AR-15, in all honesty, was kind of like a accident adoption, with lack of a better term. The Air Force adopted it, and the United States was looking to replace their M14s with new cutting-edge weaponry, and they did not want to continue to use their M14s because they were just not that useful. So they needed a middleman. They needed a rifle to hold them over for them to adopt a new rifle to replace their M14s and get rid of their old systems. Something that was better performing than a full power cartridge. Inevitably, they went with the intermediate cartridge, the 223, but they were trying to have multiple projectiles come out of the rifle at the same time to increase hit probability. There's a bunch of stuff that they were doing. I'm not going to go into a history lesson on that. But the Air Force of the United States had the AR-15, and the military basically saw that, and they were like, well, these guys already have this rifle. Let's just go ahead and get a bunch of those to hold us over for a while. And they realized how good the rifle actually was, and they ended up adopting it. Now, if something like the Mini 14 had come up, which was exactly what the military was looking for at the time of adopting an intermediate caliber cartridge, same fundamental basic systems, but in an intermediate caliber cartridge, same chambering even as what the Air Force was using, 223/556. If this had come around during the trials where they were inspecting the AR-15 for adoption, I really do genuinely believe that this right here would have been adopted. I imagine that these in full auto are way more capable of being way more accurate than your M14s. But I'm willing to bet that if these came around whenever they were testing the ARs, these right here absolutely would have been adopted. Just an assumption on my part, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption to make. Now, the reason these are called Mini 14s is literally because they are just a scaled down version of the M14. Now, the Mini 14 does take the external magazine that I just dropped on the ground. And since it takes an external magazine, it's not bound by capacity limitations like the M1 Garand is, which is, strictly 8 rounds. You can stick, I have, for me, a 5-round magazine here because it's the only magazine I have that won't upset YouTube. You can stick 5-round, 20-round, 30-round, 10-round, 15-round. I've seen 100-round drums for these things. You can stick any amount of ammunition inside of this rifle and it will run. And if you're running a military application, I imagine they would probably have the standard capacity levels of 30 rounds inside of their magazines, but that's just an assumption on my part since it never actually happened. Now, because the M14 was basically forced by higher officials in the military to be used in military service, despite how good the AR was in comparison to the M14, I really do feel like even if this had done worse than the AR, that the military would have ended up adopting something like this. These are far cheaper to make than the M14. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Far cheaper to make than the M14, but they are quite capable. There's a lot of pros and cons that come with a weapon system like this, and I'm not going to really go into the pros and cons comparing these to the AR-15. I'll save that for another video. But I don't think that these would have done as good as the AR in regards to the testing, just because we have an exposed bolt, our trigger, hammer assembly group back here. That whole fire control group is exposed to the elements by this big gaping hole over here. Old Mini 14s weren't exactly known for their accuracy. Just there's a lot of little things that really restrict the Mini 14 here. Now, the AR is definitely the better design. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. The AR is definitely the better design, but the military clearly had a bias towards this type of weapon system. So I really do bet that this right here would have been adopted if it had showed up at the trials to compete with the AR platform. Oh, somebody's getting it down there. Look at them go. I can't actually see them, but I can hear them. Oh boy, they're moving. Let's send some lead. We can make noise too, buddy. All right. With where I have the steel down there, all the spalling and whatnot goes into the microwave and it makes a little cloud spurt. Now, after you're done running your rounds, if this was the Garand, you would just load a new clip in through the top. But the Mini 14, you would pull your old mag out. I imagine that it would probably be a stick mag or something that you would use to pull out, unless they were rocking drums. I imagine if the Mini 14 was adopted, some sort of LMG style would be adopted as well, like the RPD or the RPK compared to the AK-47, but that's a topic for another time. As a matter of fact, I'll have to write that one down on my list of many topics to discuss. But you would pull out your old mag, you would throw your new mag in there with however much ammunition it is, you'd pull your charging handle back, it'd fly forward, and you'd be back in the fight. The AR platform is definitely more ergonomic, but like I said, I think the bias towards this platform would have definitely leaned to the favor of this platform. And if the Mini 14 had been adopted by the US military as opposed to the AR platform, I genuinely really believe that the AR platform would have been, some one-off thing that Armalite was doing, especially with what Armalite was having to deal with back in the day, basically going bankrupt at the time. I really do feel like the AR-15 would be some one-off project gun that we'd see on Forgotten Weapons and have never heard of, and the Mini 14 would probably still be in military use to this day, with some upgrades and exceptions. And I imagine that by now we'd have like the Galil to the AK-47 version of the Mini 14 to whatever would have existed if the military had adopted it. Yeah, that's a pretty couple of rifles. I love my Mini 14, but I love my Garand. I wish I had more 30-06 ammunition for it. Even the cheap steel case ammo is quite expensive right now, and I hate it. But I digress. If this right here had not been adopted, then the Mini 14 or this general weapons platform system likely would not have been very popular either on the US market. I'm not saying that for sure. There's several very popular platforms on the US market that have never been adopted by the US military. The Mini 14 has never been adopted by the U.S. military, but the platform of rifle has. I think that definitely leans towards it being as popular as it is. But I mean, hell, for example, look at the cheapo 22 long rifles that are out there on the market. They all have generally the same design, 10-22 box-fed magazines or the Marlin tube-fed magazine 22 long rifles. Those things are everywhere. Everyone knows them, everyone loves them. Never adopted by the military as far as I know. So there's no way to really say for sure if the AR would have taken off, but I'm fairly certain that it probably would not have taken off, especially with the Mini 14 being adopted by the military. I feel like that right there would be everybody's go-to. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for watching. This place is littered with love bugs. They are all over the ground. Holy crap. I'm just now noticing just how many of these guys there are out here, and there's a pretty tremendous amount. Thanks for watching, folks. Let me know what y'all's thoughts are down below. I imagine you're probably going to do that anyway. I imagine somebody down below saw me run the steel case and talked about the steel case, and they're still going to go down in the comments and tell me that I shouldn't run steel case ammo through my M1 for these particular purposes, and that's exactly the test that we're running here. Like I said, I'm just shy of 800 rounds. I think I'm at like 760 once I finish the box that I'm currently running through this rifle. No real significant issues with it so far. As long as I have that updated gas system, you know, tuned properly, I don't think I'll have any problems at all. The steel that we're using nowadays is way softer than the steel ammo that was used way back in the day. Just the metallurgy that exists nowadays is way better than what used to exist way back in the day. And the steel is so soft that it mimics brass very, very well. And as a result, that steel rubbing on those feed lips, it just does not seem to be causing any problems whatsoever. And as long as I have the gas system tuned properly, it doesn't seem to be causing any problems with the extractor either. But once I hit 1,000 rounds through this thing, we're going to go ahead and double check that. Just check it out, look through it. If you decide to run a bunch of steel through your M1 and you don't use an updated gas system, your results may vary. Or hell, maybe you're running an M1 from like the 1930s as opposed to mine, which is the 1950s. Metallurgy had gotten better, stronger, just things progressed better during that time period. But like I said before, we're going to save the rest of that explanation for another video. Thanks for watching, folks. Subscribe to the channel, like the video. Description down below has a link to all sorts of different things. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day. Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.